Hi there everybody, and welcome to episode 262 of the Art of Procurement. And today I'm going to continue our mini-series that I started last week. So if you recall, in episode 261, I answered a listener question about maintaining relationships through tough negotiations. And I promised that this week I'd share some negotiation tips that were part of a keynote presentation that Joanna Martinez and I gave at ProcureCon Indirect West last year and ProcureCon Indirect East this year. And by the way, for all Art of Procurement listeners, you do get 20% off your ticket to any ProcureCon North America event. It's an ongoing kind of partnership that we have with ProcureCon. And you can do that just by going to artofprocurement.com/procurecon. That's artofprocurement.com/procurecon, and you'll find all the details there. So you might listen to these tips today and think, well, that's obvious. But as we know, being obvious doesn't mean that something still gets done. So it's really important to keep these on our radar in the heat of the battle that a negotiation can sometimes become. So today I'm briefly going to talk about childcare, ducks, and power. And I promise you those three things will make sense as I go into them. So childcare, throughout my career, I've had the pleasure of buying a broad range of products and services. So armrests for Jaguar cars, to LED headlights for Cadillacs, to marketing agencies, legal e-discovery services, and a heck of a lot more in between. And so for this first tip, I actually used a picture of our youngest son on the screen in the presentation, because it's not often that you can get your kids into a business presentation. So I managed to get that in there at ProcureCon in this presentation that we gave. Because one of the things that I never thought that I would be buying was a Montessori childcare center. And this was certainly a long time before we had any children of our own. So when I was kind of given that remit, I was a little bit like a fish out of water, I would say. Like, where do you even start? So the situation was, I worked for a company. We're in a relatively remote location in the UK. We needed to attract a lot of highly skilled and educated workers. And childcare was really a must as a retention tool more than anything else for the business. So we were all set. We had done an RFP. We'd gone to market to find the childcare providers that we liked. We'd spent a lot of time kind of understanding the teaching philosophies. And then all the budgets were cut. So the company could no longer afford to bring in a supplier to kind of set up a childcare center. But where the challenge is that they really still did need to open that childcare center and had already made commitments to new hires that it was coming. What we did have in this situation was a building that the center could actually be put into. So we'd done a lot of the work. I said we'd gone to RFP. We did an RFI before it as well. So we understood the market. But in this situation, rather than scrap the project because we had no budget, we started to ask all the potential providers, a lot more thorough discovery questions about what did they really want from partnering with us. So it seems pretty simple, right? But one of the facts that, I've learned from a number of sales professionals that I really look up to is that the most important element of the salesperson's toolbox, and they're doing this to us all the time, they're doing it to all of our stakeholders all the time, is really to understand what do we really want, what is behind, the participation. For example, from a supplier perspective, and why are they really getting involved in this RFP in the first place? And I know certainly at that time in my career, I'd assumed that I knew what a supplier wants. The supplier wants price. They want the highest possible price, and they want the highest possible profit. Obviously, what I've learned is that in almost every single one of the negotiations or strategies that I've developed and executed, and those that have really provided oversized, and in some cases, some pretty unheard of returns, they were all based on the strategy of really understanding what's important to the other party, and then working with them to provide it in a way that gives a mutual win. So do they need help in increasing the utilization rate of a particular production line or a call center? Do they want to test a new business model, test a new product, bring a new product to market? Do they want your logo and testimonial to help in their marketing efforts? So in this case, what we found by going a lot deeper into understanding what suppliers wanted who were participating in this RFP is that one of the potential suppliers really wanted to expand their operations overseas in as risk-free way as possible. So in knowing that, we were then able to build a partnership where we provided this empty building that we had rent-free, and the provider built out and subsidized the cost of the childcare center itself. So we had a childcare centre. They had their flagship childcare centre that could then be used to demonstrate their capabilities in a new country. And this was really important to them because they had an existing large US client base that also had facilities in the UK, but that were afraid to be the first ones taking the leap into a new market with this supplier. So having the childcare centre with us now enabled them to showcase that to their other larger US clients who are based in the UK and really serve as the base for their entry into the UK market. So the second tip that I shared at ProcureCon was I used a picture of a duck, a duck swimming gracefully above water. And what you don't see is that it's paddling like crazy underneath to make that graceful glide just look so easy. Like much in life, success in a negotiation, it comes from 90% preparation and 10% execution. And I'll be honest, this tip is a big one for me to remember. Again, it seems obvious, but it's really hard because most of the time, certainly for me when I was a practitioner and frankly today as an entrepreneur, it's really easy to find yourself running around from call to call, meeting to meeting, firing off as many emails as you can in between all those calls and emails. Like, where do you get the time to actually sit down, plan, and prepare? However, a couple of negotiation experts we've had on the pod, and I'm thinking of Jeanette Nyden and Mark Raffin, they both come to mind. Have reminded me at different times of the importance of planning and preparation for every single interaction. So we're very good as procurement professionals at having an overarching strategy. But sometimes we see the details, those calls, emails, meetings, as perhaps a little bit more tactical, and we enter them without that much preparation. Now, I mentioned before that, I had the opportunity to observe some really leading sales professionals, and their superpower, is the ability to ask questions, such as we covered in the last tip, and then spending and making the time to spend like the majority of the time being prepared and preparing for each interaction. So whether it's planning which questions to ask, whether it's planning on how to build rapport with the other side, planning what observations to look for and what goals to have, and importantly, putting together a plan to achieve those goals. That's what's been really important for each interaction. So again, you can be sure the sales folks on the other side of the table are doing that with us and with our stakeholders. So a focus on planning, along with then asking the right questions, is a really, really powerful 1-2 punch when you go into a negotiation and when you go into every single interaction within a negotiation. And so with punching in mind, that brings me to the third and final tip today. The third visual that I had in this negotiation tips presentation was one of a boxer, somebody who's bigger and stronger than their opponent, punching that much smaller opponent. Now, I'm not one for violence, but the visual was to discuss the topic of power. And the question that I asked then is this, when you have power in a negotiation or in a supplier relationship, how hard do you actually push? And for me, this is both an ethical and a strategic question. Back in my automotive days when I bought direct components and materials, there's definitely a time when we were conditioned to think about every transaction based entirely on power dynamics. And frankly, with it, as a zero-sum win-lose kind of game. And I'll say that, while it may be more prevalent in those automotive days, I have still seen this across industry. So by no way is this just an automotive thing. It just so happens that that's where I got some of my grounding in the beginning of my career. And the issue basically boils down to this. Should I take everything that a supplier is willing to give? And there are many occasions when the balance of power has a significant imbalance in your favor. In the direct material space, in an industry like automotive, and I'll just go back to that because, that's where I had a lot of direct experience. It may be because you're one of only 3 potential customers in the world for that supplier. Should they lose your business, because they're insistent that they couldn't go any lower on a price, and you decide not to give them any business or never to give them any business again because you feel like they're not acting in your best interests, then suddenly they've lost 1/3 of their total available market. In the indirect services space, you could be working with a small supplier who's dependent on the contract that they're pitching to you to survive for the next month, the next 6 months, the next year. In those situations, and they're probably more common than you realize, they really put the suppliers in a difficult position because they really need to win that business at all costs. And they're really thinking about it from a short-term perspective rather than a longer-term perspective. The likelihood is that anything that you ask for, you're going to get it. And that may be great for you as well, for the short-term fix of increasing your cost savings goal and what you've achieved in cost savings, but it can obviously have a lot longer-term consequences. I've seen a number of times on the direct side where companies couldn't afford the concessions that they gave, and they've had to be rescued by the buyer. And it costs a lot more money than to help rescue a supplier than those extra savings that you're able to squeeze out. Or, the small business that said yes to a 50% reduction in price because you told them, well, that's what my budget is. And 90-day payment terms because you said, well, that's what our corporate standard is. They'll say yes to that. But then the founders, maybe they'll struggle to pay the bills and spend the time that really could have been spent providing the best outcome possible for you, instead redirecting physical resources to get more sales, to cover any gap, or emotional resources, wondering how the heck are we going to actually make this deal work that we felt that we really had to take. So I know a lot of my procurement colleagues, a lot of you listening may say that, well, we can't be responsible for the deal that is offered by the supplier. They have all the available information on their side that we don't. They obviously wouldn't make that deal if they couldn't abide by that deal, if they couldn't make that deal work. I used to say that myself, but the reality is that we do have an obligation to ensure that we get the quality and the deliverables needed. And really to understand if when we're in a position of high power, where we have a lot of leverage, are we asking for an unsustainable deal from a supplier? So here's my tip, and this was the third tip of the presentation. Use data, not power. If you're convinced that something should cost less, rather than just using the power card, use information, cost breakdowns, or develop should cost models, for example, as a way to use that as a basis of discussion with supplier. Or in an ideal world, you can approach the supplier to discuss an open book costing approach, where you agree to a certain profit margin, where they show you their cost breakdowns. If this is a supplier that's important to you, a part of your future strategy, it's going to be far more effective to build a relationship where you're helping them manage or improve their own cost structures through things like open book costing, while guaranteeing them a profit margin or a burden allocation, so they don't feel like they're squeezed to the bone. The alternative is that you tell them the price, and that if they can't meet the price, they're not going to get or retain the business. And obviously, again, that puts them in a very difficult position, especially if you have a lot of power and leverage in that discussion. You're really going to find yourself with just a bunch of tactical suppliers doing what they can to, be able to provide at the cost that you've asked for, or the price that you've asked for, rather than a supplier who's going to work with you to, and that feel comfortable that at least that their kind of bills are going to get paid while working together on managing costs so you still get the lowest possible price. So those are the 3 tips that I shared at ProcureCon. As I said at the top of the show, these are likely not new to you, but I think it's always good to be reminded, to make sure that we keep these at the front of our mind as we enter into negotiations and pricing discussions with our suppliers. So to recap, first is seek to understand what the other party really wants from a negotiation, because it may actually be very different from what you're assuming. Second, your preparation and planning for the small stuff is really what makes a negotiation succeed or fail. And then lastly, be selective in the use of your power in circumstances where, you have the balance of power in a negotiation, but, ask yourself, can you get to the same result using other means? And that may mean a far more fulfilling long-term relationship and improved results even with that supplier, other than just playing the power card. Okay, so that's all there is for today's episode. I want to thank you for joining me today on Art of Procurement, and we're going to be back next week, the same time, same place, 6 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time every Monday. In the meantime, I've been recording a number of interviews to share with you throughout August and beyond. We have the CPO from the National Basketball Association, the NBA. I'm really excited to share that one with you. A CPO from MDC Partners, and a deep dive into the consulting category, along with a discussion with a category lead, so a practitioner, on how to help build your profile on social media. So those are all interviews that are going to be coming your way in the next few weeks. So until next time, I want to thank you once again for tuning in to this week's Art of Procurement. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll speak to you all again next week. Hi there, I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.